All right. People are slowly entering the Zoom room. Hello. My name is Morgan, and I'm an event manager at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you all to PNP Live. Soon, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can pre-order a copy of After 100 Winters in Search of Reconciliation on America's Stolen Land, straight from PNP's website. The title officially will be released on October 19th, which is next Tuesday. You can ask our speakers a question by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of the program, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there are auto captions for this event by hitting the live caption button at the bottom of your screen. Before we introduce tonight's guests, I want to make sure to mention that today on Indigenous Peoples Day, we would like to acknowledge that our store sits on ancestral lands belonging to the Natchitoches, Anacostan, and Piscataway people. To acknowledge this land is also to acknowledge the long history of colonization, dispossession, and the erasure of Indigenous communities to this land. We encourage our community to take time today and every day to reflect on the land we live on and listen to Indigenous voices telling their own stories. Our featured author tonight is Margaret D. Jacobs, the professor of history and the director of the Center for Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her books include White Mother to a Dark Race, Settler Colonialism, Maternalism, and the Removal of Indigenous Children in the American West in Australia, 1880 to 1940. Jacobs will be in conversation with Alaina E. Roberts, an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on the intersection of Black and Native American life from the 19th century to the modern day, with particular attention to identity, settler colonialism, and anti-Blackness. In addition to her first book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, and multiple academic articles, her writing has appeared in outlets like the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and her work has been profiled by the likes of CNN and the Boston Globe. You can find her on Twitter at @allthewhile1. Let's give our guests a virtual round of applause.
Okay, well, first of all, I will say again, congratulations on your new book, Margaret.
Thanks, Alaina.
So I first encountered your work when I read your award-winning book, White Mother to a Dark Race, in graduate school, and I'm sure that that was the introduction for many folks attending tonight. That book really spoke to me and many others in my 19th century US history class because it was a really great introduction to the comparative effects of settler colonialism. It refocused the narrative around boarding schools from their white founders to the Indigenous children and the families affected by these policies in the United States and Australia. And this, of course, has been a constant theme of your work, to put a face, often that of a woman and a child, to the governmental policies that harmed and shaped Indigenous life. And for so long, were written about as if they were positive developments. And I see 100 Winters as a continuance of this theme and of your pattern of imbuing your work with a piece of your own story, but this book, of course, is much more personal and even more kind of meditative about not just the story that you tell, but also your place as an actor in this ongoing story. So could you start by telling us how you decided that this was your next book?
Well, I don't know how you work, Alaina, but for me, sometimes I start out with an idea and then the idea takes on its own life. And then that just kind of, I just have to follow that idea where it leads me. And that's kind of what happened with this book. I'd been working, as you mentioned, that book, White Mother to a Dark Race, and the one that followed it was all about Indigenous family separation and Indigenous child removal, which has been going on for over a century. In this country, in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all settler colonial nations where mostly an English population has overtaken the Indigenous population. But anyway, I'd been working on that topic for a long time. And I got really taken with what was happening in Australia and Canada, and that they were actually having truth and reconciliation processes around Indigenous child removal. There was a Stolen Generations Inquiry in Australia in the 1990s. There was a Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the from around 2009 to 2015. And I at first I was just really taken with and thinking we need something like this in the United States. We've had the exact same policies and they've been so damaging to Indigenous people. And there's such a gross human rights abuse that we need something like this in the US. So I kind of got the idea that I'd like to do a comparative national truth and reconciliation book, but the book took a really different turn. And in part, it's because we don't have much going on at the national level here in the United States until recently, until we now have the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who's from Laguna Pueblo, and she has taken initiatives to study some of the things like the Indian boarding schools. But when I started writing this book, nothing like that was happening. And one of the decisions I made early on was I really wanted to do interviews with people in the US and around the world who were working on truth and reconciliation, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous together. And I reached out to a local journalist here in Lincoln named Kevin Abarask, who's from the Rosebud Lakota Nation. And he and I started doing these interviews together. And I just met so many interesting people who were working at the grassroots, who were doing this kind of work of trying to grapple with this really hard history and then make some sort of redress for it. And in very imaginative and innovative and thrilling ways. And so the book became much more about the grassroots, at least in the context of the US. It also became much more personal for me. I mean, I've always felt like just a personal outrage about some of the policies I write about and the practices I write about. But when I started really delving deeply into truth and reconciliation processes, I realized that, I can't just be the aloof professor who writes about these things, that I too am complicit in these as a descendant of settlers, that I must wrestle with my own place in the world and in the United States. I must know the places where I grew up and where I live now. I must know them more deeply than I ever have before. I must realize what happened to Indigenous peoples on these lands. So yes, the book is a departure in some ways from my academic work, but it's kind of built on that. And it's not really meant to be an academic book. It's meant more for a much larger, more general audience.
Well, one of the many things that I like about the book is that you take us on that journey with you. I mean, you tell us about your childhood and where you grew up and kind of the native history behind that space in Colorado and all these kinds of places where you meet these people who are doing this kinds of work. And so I wanted to ask you about being kind of a character in this work. This is kind of like a tool that scholars have used, increasingly more accepted, I don't know, the past 5, maybe 10 years, but I feel like it's usually used for people who are like from marginalized groups who maybe are writing about family history or using oral histories to kind of flesh out parts that are not in the archive. But you are kind of taking it from the opposite way and writing from that settler standpoint and asking other settlers to pay more attention to this history.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in some ways, I'm very inspired by scholars who are from, what if we want to say marginalized groups who do write from that personal space and really make themselves vulnerable. And I really think, for a very long time, settlers like me have not marked ourselves as settlers. We haven't said, it's very common right now if a person's from an Indigenous background that after their name they'll put their their tribal nation within parentheses. Or, people will be very upfront. I'm African American, or I'm Latinx, or whatever. But those of us who are white and settlers often don't have much self-reflection about that, or much public reflection about that. And I just think it's really important to do so. And I think that one of the themes of the book is the ways in which many people want to deny history, especially settlers. White settlers want to deny this history. They only want to tell this very sanitized or heroic version of this history. They might want to wallow in the nostalgia of the homesteading era or something, but they don't want to talk about or think about how Indigenous people were dispossessed from this land so that their ancestors could then move on to this land. So I really think it's important to be really, to really own that history as a settler, to really come to grips with it. And even if your ancestors did not participate in some of the horrific genocidal violence against Indigenous peoples, if you're living on this land, you're benefiting from that happened. And I think there's a great class of us people in the United States who I would call beneficiaries of settler colonialism. And we really need to own that and be responsible for it and be accountable for it. And that's one of the themes of the book as well.
Well, and what I like, but what I know will perhaps be controversial, is the group of people that you class as settlers. And this is something I look at in my work that I've gotten pushback about. You're not just identifying white people as settlers. You're, as you said, you're talking about people who are now living on this land, who are benefiting from a system that dispossessed people, even if they themselves were not necessarily part of that directly. So how did you decide to kind of make that decision about that terminology?
Well, this isn't, in some ways, this really isn't a book about race, although it's a book about reckoning with our history. It's a book about indigeneity and people who are non-Indigenous. Of course, there's so many intersections between non-Indigenous people, who I call settlers in the book, and race. And there's a lot of ways in which white supremacy work in concert with settler colonialism to privilege white settlers in particular. But it is true, and I see this in your own work, that we realize that even though African Americans suffered huge amounts as being enslaved, many African Americans in the West were able to homestead, or they were able to gain land that Indigenous people had only recently been removed from. And that's not to demonize African Americans who were settlers. It's just to show the incredible complexity of this. And your work's so wonderful because it shows a more complexity still of Native Americans who enslaved African Americans. So this is a complex history. I don't focus much on that topic, but I really just want people to grapple with the fact that we live on stolen land, and what are we going to do about it? What are we going to not? We make acknowledgements now, land acknowledgements, but what is the next step, and how are we going to take steps to recover from and heal from this history, and move in a new direction?
Definitely. And I think those are questions that anyone and everyone needs to be thinking about. And your book, because it's talking about interactions between settlers and Native people, is it kind of more a call to, like, specifically settlers to rethink this history and kind of work toward reconciliation, or is it kind of equally also toward Native people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want this book to be for anyone and everyone. But I have to be frank that I write as a white settler, and I really do want to reach other white settlers. I want I want, this is the group of people who I feel like can sail through life and never think about this history, deny it. And I particularly want to reach them and to get them to really grapple with this history and really think about it, and then think about like what can they do in their own life and wherever they are about this issue of being settlers on stolen land.
I mean, with the past year and a half, there have been so many calls to, read books by authors, Black and white, about anti-racism and how can we work toward, understanding diversity or inclusion or equity, et cetera. I feel like that was predominantly about Black people, for reasons, obviously, directly related to the murder of George Floyd. But there was such a conversation about, like, should we be reading books written by white authors? But I feel like, as you said, sometimes people need kind of someone like them maybe reaching out to say, hey, like, I understand why you maybe didn't learn this history, or why you maybe feel like this history didn't apply to you. And I'm telling you how I kind of had this realization, and like, you can also have this realization.
Yeah, I think that's true. I started writing this book 6 or 7 years ago. And so it was a really different moment when I started writing this book. But, I've been searching out and finding works like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and, noticing that there were white people writing about these topics, as well as, non-white people writing about anti-racism. So I think in some ways the book fits within that kind of context of those books, but it's not about, it does make references to a lot of things that have happened around African Americans and reparations, slavery, but it's primarily about Indigenous peoples and this fraught relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And it's, I do think it's not so much that white settlers need to hear this from another white settler, but it's just that I think that it can be useful for a white person to see another white person say, oh, that person is thinking about this. I can think about this. And one thing I do in the book is, it's not all about me. In fact, it's not about me a lot. But I really like to focus on various people I've interviewed with Kevin that are doing these amazing things. For example, Art and Helen Tanderup. They are a white settler farm family in their mid-60s living in central Nebraska, and they've given back 10 acres of land to the Ponca people whose homelands that they have settled on. And Helen Tanderup had this homestead in her family since the 1870s or 80s. So she and Art, I think they're a great example of what you could do to become aware of this history and then to make some sort of real restitution for it. I mean, that's the bedrock redress, is giving land back. I think there's a parallel to this book in that it could have been all about, oh, look at these great white people, look what they're doing. They're giving land to, this group, they're doing this. It's not meant to be like, oh, look at these white saviors. It's more, I think, we don't cover, in general, we don't cover these kinds of actions that are happening, these kinds of reconciliation events and practices that are going on, especially over, the 4 years of the Trump administration that I was writing this book. You never heard about this at all. We only heard about people behaving really cruelly and cynically. And I really, this kind of got me through those 4 years because it allowed me to meet so many people who were doing really amazing things about promoting social justice. And we're doing it on a very personal and a very grassroots level. And I think, colonialism was very intimate. That's one thing I've always focused on in my own writing, is that colonialism didn't happen in a very abstract way up here. It really affected people and their families and their very own bodies. And so I think decolonization and reconciliation also have to happen in this intimate way. And so the book really gets into that kind of, what would that mean to have this kind of intimate reconciliation, intimate decolonization?
Right. And I think that's why it gets at kind of the root of a lot of people's hesitancy, I feel like, to think about this history, because they think of it as something big and like, I can't affect change. It's like it has to come from the government. But yeah, you show in this story, the Tanderups, who you start the book with and end the book with, that they themselves took that action to not just the kind of last section, the restitution, but also to listen to these people who were affected by settler colonialism, and not to kind of take offense and back off, but to really kind of embrace that learning process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the tendency of a lot of white settlers when they are confronted with this material is to be quite defensive, to say, well, yeah, maybe all that horrific things happened, these massacres happened, these land dispossession happened, these trails of tears happened, these exiles happened, but look at all these great things that happened, look at all this progress. And so I think there's this impulse to be very defensive, and the book is really a kind of, what would happen if we dared not to be defensive? What would happen if we dared to confront this history head on? And what would happen if we formed really deep, meaningful relationships across this divide between settlers and Indigenous people, and created and co-created a new web of relationships, and created ways for Native people to regain their land, whether that's giving the land back outright, like the Tanderups did, or Roger Welsh is another person I talk about, who gave 60 acres of land to the Pawnee people, or if it's you're a farmer and you make 20 acres of your land available each year for the Pawnee to plant their corn on. So there's just a really vast array of different ways people are practicing reconciliation.
Well, and I think the Tanderups are a particularly great example because they get to know these Ponca people through their shared activism with the Keystone Pipeline. And a big question I heard when that was going on was, are these kind of interracial coalitions going to last? Or is this the moment and then people will forget about like Native people and Native history? And I think that shows that, like, no, there certainly were strong relationships created in that moment, and in other moments like of interracial coalition. And like now with Black Lives Matter, there are Native people who have joined in that conversation. And I would like to think kind of optimistically that this means like this is possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that in some cases activism is very ephemeral, and those coalitions and alliances that form around political activism are not always longstanding. But in this case, they really were. The Tanderups, they started providing land for the Poncas to replant their sacred corn, which they hadn't planted in Nebraska for over 100 years. So that's the title, After 100 Winters. And they didn't know if the seeds would grow. And so that's one of the metaphors, of course, in the book about the seeds growing after 100 winters. But these relationships also developing after exile, after genocide, after these horrific policies of the Indian boarding schools and allotment of Indian land, that there are still people who are coming together and forming these lasting relationships. So, you know, the Poncas started planting their corn on the Tandarip's land in 2013. And in 2018, the Tandarip's gave them that land. It's just 10 acres. It's not a huge amount of land, but every year they come up and they plant and they have this, you know, wonderful, like I've been to the celebration and they, you know, have a big meal together, they plant corn together, they talk, they laugh, they, you know, sing, they, you know, and I know that the Tandarips and some of the Ponca people he's gotten to be really good friends, they've gotten to be really good friends with, they go back and forth all the time. And then the Ponca people come back to harvest their corn as well, and there's another celebration. So yes, it's a meaningful relationship, and it's not just a unique one-off situation. And that was something else that Kevin and I kept finding is we had this wonderful graduate student working with us named Balir Ben Taleb, and Balir was our person who would just search through news items and find examples of land back or restitution or other forms of reconciliation. And so we created a website called Reconciliation Rising, and it has all these examples of what we call acts of reconciliation or practices of reconciliation.
Yeah, I was going to mention the website. It's an amazing project. So if you have not gone yet, I would encourage you to visit that site. So you mentioned land back. So do you see this as land back, the same as that movement?
I don't think it's the same. I mean, that's a movement that's very much, you know, initiated, led by Indigenous people that and I may have this history wrong, but as I understand it, it came about when President Trump went to Mount Rushmore to make a speech for his reelection campaign. And as I understand it, that's when that kind of this group in that area decided to create this land back movement. But of course, you know, Native people have been trying to get their land back ever since it was lost. And they've tried everything. They've tried court cases. You know, they try raising money and buying back their own land. But I've been finding these things where churches are giving back land, or environmental organizations are giving, like the Nature Conservancy has given some land back to Native people. I mean, it's different. It's not, this is kind of quiet, and it's kind of off the radar. But I think it complements the land back movement. And I think it's really important to, again, to sort of encourage settlers who have land to consider giving land back in this way. And for settlers who don't have land, there's still other things that can be done to promote reconciliation.
Well, and something that complements land back, but also is not kind of the same thing. I was thinking of McGirt as I read the book, which, you know, it's not giving land back, but it's giving, like, reinforcing tribal sovereignty, reinforcing jurisdiction over land.
Definitely. Yeah, so there's a lot of different things coming together right now that, but one of the points I make in the book is I look both to the past and I look internationally. Especially, I guess right now to talk about the international stuff, you know, I look, you know, particularly because of my interest in Indigenous child removal, I look at the Stolen Generations Inquiry and the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I really, at first, I just was kind of like all starry-eyed about these. It's like, wow, can't we have one of these, you know? But then I realized, you know, especially reading Indigenous critiques of those in both countries, that they ultimately were not as satisfying as you would hope that they would be. They weren't as healing. They didn't bring justice to Indigenous people. And so part of the book is thinking about, well, why was that? Why didn't they do that? And what could we learn from that in the United States? And one of the things that really stood out for me was, and many critics mention this, is that they never dealt with the founding crime of land theft. And in some ways, some critics of reconciliation see it as a real distraction from, real restitution, which they see as the foundational crime was land theft. So the foundational redress has to be return of land. And a lot of Indigenous people really make the connection between healing all sorts of aspects of their lives, families, cultures, nations through land and their spiritual connections to land. So I think that was where some of these movements went awry, is that they never really dealt with land. And so I think we need to be really cognizant of that in this country and really think about how can we get land back into the hands of Native people, the homelands especially.
Do you think it's possible to be in an ideal world, like maybe have so much movement on kind of the smaller individual and local levels that you maybe don't need the kind of more symbolic, I don't know, more public apologies from the United States, or, something that we may never get from a country like this?
Yeah, well, at first I kind of thought the local and the grassroots was kind of a second best. It's like, well, it's the consolation prize. If you don't have the big Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on, at least you have this. But now I have a really different view of it. And partly I've been really influenced by Sherilyn Ifill, who's the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I met Sherilyn, and she's written this great book called On the Courthouse Lawn about lynching. But it's about communities who are dealing with lynching, 100 years later or many, many years later. And she makes the point in that book, and she made the point when we talked to each other, that those local efforts are really important because that's where these atrocities happened. They may, in the case of Indigenous people, they were often done in the name of the federal government, but they happen in specific places and specific times on specific lands. And so those restitution, reconciliation that occurs in those local areas is really meaningful and important. But I think we need it all. I think it won't be satisfying to Indigenous people in this country if there isn't also a national recognition of what happened, and a true apology that's really heartfelt and very specific about the wrongs that Indigenous people suffered. But I think those apologies can happen at the local level, at the state level, and also at the federal level. I think we can build support for a national effort from all this local grassroots work that's going on. And again, another one of the things I saw internationally, and talking to people who were really involved in the truth and reconciliation processes in Canada and Australia, is that many of them talked about how frustrating it was to get settlers on board, everyday settlers. Like, there were these processes going on up here, and Indigenous people were kind of pouring out their hearts and having to relive horrible traumas about what they'd experienced. But some settlers could just be like, they could just tune out. They could just shrug their shoulders and do nothing. But in this country, the way this sort of local processes are going on, I think it's a good thing. It's not a second best thing. It's something that's essential, and it's really critical to meaningful reconciliation, or what some Canadians call transformative reconciliation, something that's not just done to feel good or to check a box, but that really transforms relationships.
So I wanted to tell the audience a little more about your book and go back in time a bit. So the book is divided into 2 sections, which first kind of educate on what you call these founding crimes, and then you analyze these various efforts that we've just been discussing about reconciliation. So you ground us kind of in the history of your home state of Colorado, which is the homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. You talk about Sand Creek, which I think is far more well known now, maybe because of the work of Ari Kelman and others.
Yes.
And one person you talk about is a white American trapper named William Bent. So Bent marries several Cheyenne women. He becomes accepted as kind of a tribal leader. And when more white settlers move into the area looking to displace these Native people, he writes a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And I found him particularly interesting because in my own tribes, the Choctaw and Chickasaw, we've had a lot of white intermarriage, but most of those men were not kind of advocating for their wives' people. And that's kind of similar to, the reformers that you also talk about in the book, who are the more kind of traditional reformers that we know of, who, have their own problematic ideas about Native people, have their own reasons for getting involved with Native people. A lot of white women used this advocacy to really kind of come out of the resistance to white American female kind of participation in politics and the public life, which of course you've written about in multiple books. Do you feel there are people in the earlier period that you write about, like the 19th century, who are like unproblematic allies? Like, are there any people who really kind of take this work on because they really do see Native people as equal to themselves?
That's a really great question. And in my research and writing, the person that maybe comes closest to that is Helen Hunt Jackson. I have a chapter that's almost entirely about her called Rousing the Conscience of a Nation. And she, I talk about the Ponca people, how they were exiled from their homelands. And then the Ponca chief standing bearer went on a speaking tour with Suzette LaFlèche, who was an Omaha woman who was his interpreter. They went on a speaking tour of the East Coast, and they really mobilized all these white settlers who then started calling themselves Friends of the Indian. It's so problematic in so many ways. I don't think Helen Hunt Jackson ever called herself that, but she was actually, that's how she got interested in this topic. And she had she'd been an abolitionist. There had been a lot of white reformers who got interested in American Indians who had been abolitionists. There was almost a kind of continuity in some ways. And she just got really incensed by what happened to the Poncas, and she started really educating herself, not only about what the Poncas had experienced, but all sorts of other Native people, including the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek, the Ute people of Colorado, because she'd settled in Colorado. In fact, I grew up really near where she was. And then she became really interested in California Indians and the way that they had been like so unjustly dispossessed of their lands. And she just wrote incessantly about this. And she focused really a lot on this land issue. And she was a tireless advocate for returning land. But she only lived to, I believe she died in 1885. So she only lived for like the 6-year period after she learned of what had happened to the Poncas. I don't know if she would have done what all these other Friends of the Indian did, which was at first they were all up in arms about land and they wanted to return land. They were incensed about what had happened to the Poncas. They wanted the Poncas to come back to their homelands and get back their lands. But then very quickly, they started moving to a totally different agenda, which was Indian boarding schools and allotment of Indian land, which ended up stealing 90 million more acres of land from Native people. So I don't know if Helen Hunt Jackson, if she'd lived longer, would have gone that same route. So many white people did, where they just really, I think, had this very paternalistic attitude toward Native people. They thought they knew what was best. They didn't really trust Indian people to know what was best for them, and I think too, they would have had to really do a huge amount of soul searching to think about land use and land, this is the homesteading area. This is the era in which all these white settlers are taking over land. And it seems like most of these white friends of the Indian weren't really able to face up to that and call for that reversal at that time. But yeah, great question. Were there any unproblematic allies? That's probably not. Even Helen Hunt Jackson tended to really portray Native people in a very victimized way. But yeah, that's a good question. And again, for me, that's a really cautionary tale. It's like, how do we white settlers today, are we going to cause more harm again? Are we going to cause more damage? What can keep us from doing that? And for me, it's always about really listening to Indigenous people about what are their aspirations, supporting what it is they're doing, and kind of playing a backseat role. And that's very different from the 19th century Friends of the Indian, which is like, we want to, we're in the driver's seat, just listen to us. We'll solve the so-called Indian problem. So I really want to learn from what happened in the past, and I want to learn from what happened internationally as well.
Yeah, that transition that you mentioned was so interesting to me, because I, studying predominantly the later 19th century, I was familiar with the more destructive so-called helping the Indian, but not the kind of previous more nobler intentions. So very interesting.
Yeah, and I had not really, I'd studied that era and that work of the Friends of the Indian before, but I hadn't really noticed that there was this brief moment when they were really focused on land and treaty rights, and that they just really quickly abandoned that, just within a year or two. It was striking, and it's sad, because it was a moment, and it was a moment kind of like Reconstruction for African Americans, where so much strife, so much repair could have been done right then, and instead we just went into a sort of whirlpool of further atrocities for African Americans and Native Americans.
Right. Those moments. Okay, so I will get into some audience questions.
Okay.
So please keep submitting, audience. Let's see. Okay, from Alexa Wolishin. She says, you mentioned communities, farmers, churches who are contributing to land back efforts. What do you see universities doing? And for instance, what is your university doing?
I love that question. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Alexa.
Yeah, that is such a great question. And many of you in the audience may be familiar with a very influential article that was written in High Country News. Is it 2019, 2020? Yeah. It's by Tristan Ottone and Robert Lee. And it's called Land Grab Universities. So I teach at a land grant university, and I've always made that joke even before that article came out, that we're really a land grab university. And so, but they did this amazing article that shows just how all these so-called land grant universities, are built on Indian land, and then they have ongoing investments in Indian land. They're still making money from Indian land. So I just learned, Northwestern has been doing some really interesting things because they were founded by Governor Evans of Colorado, who was really partly responsible for Sand Creek. So they did a huge study of Governor Evans' role in that, but they're not a land grant university. Ohio State University has a project, and I'm not remembering the name at the moment, but it's really to look at themselves internally about their land grant status and how much they profited from Indian land. We have started some conversations at my own university, at University of Nebraska, with my wonderful colleague, Margaret Hittle, who is Anishinaabe. And she and I and others at the university who really care about this are really hoping, and well, we've had some conversations with our chancellor about So what are you going to do about this? You know, the fact that our university has made money off of Indian people, what are some steps you can take? You know, other universities are talking about things like, they're not ready to go to the land back, but they're talking about things like free tuition for Native students. We're talking about establishing an Indigenous garden on our campus. But, you know, we're also holding a summit next April called Reckoning and Reconciliation on the Great Plains. We've invited Tristan Ottone to speak at that, as well as a lot of other Native and African American speakers about these topics. And we're really hoping that will be a catalyst for our university much more seriously facing its role as a land grant institution. So I love that question. I'm a big believer in we all should start where we are. And so I'm a university professor, and what can I do at my university to get them to realize their complicity in this and the way that they've been a beneficiary. So thank you for that question.
Well, on the note of Black and Native people, anonymous attendee says, is there a way for African Americans and Indigenous folks to join together and fight for reparations? And if the US government isn't giving land back, is there more of a chance for money to be given to Indigenous people?
Yeah, you know, I don't think it's my place to say, oh, Indigenous people and Black people should get together, you know, but you know, again, if that's something, people are already doing that, you know, at Standing Rock protests, a lot of African Americans went there, and a lot of Indigenous people joined in the Black Lives Matter protest here in Lincoln, our Lincoln Indian Center. In fact, Kevin Abarusk is really active in that, and he's been like, there's just been a great sort of movement of Indigenous and African American and Latinx working together on these social justice issues. But the idea of reparations is really interesting. When I first started writing this book, I just thought, well, that's the key, right? Is putting your money where your mouth is. And in fact, I have a chapter called Where Your Mouth Is. It follows a chapter on apologies. But, you know, the more I've studied it, the more it's, you know, I went to a really interesting conference up in Canada about, the Canadian government did pay reparations to First Nations people who were survivors of their Indian residential schools. And their whole process that they used to determine who would get money and how much money was really traumatizing. And many of the survivors I met talked about this. They had to talk about sexual abuse that they'd suffered. It wasn't a healing thing, and the money, it didn't feel like enough. I don't mean like it didn't feel like enough money. It didn't feel like it really brought justice. And some people expressed they felt like they were being paid off, and now they were supposed to be silent, and they weren't supposed to talk about this anymore. And there was this sense that we're paid up, now go home and stop talking about it. And so I think reparations is a key part of this. And I do think it can alleviate some of the ill feelings and promote some justice, but it can't be alone. I mean, there has to be, I talk about a lot of other sort of principles of redress that have to be in place. And one of them is apologies and changing the historical narrative that we tell, especially through memorials and public commemorations. Another is reparations, of course, creating sort of social service healing programs, in this case, that are led by Indigenous people. And then there has to be a really strong never again component of like vowing that this kind of policies and practices will never happen again. And that was a real shortcoming in Australia and Canada, because even as they're having these conversations about these abuses of Indigenous children, they are still pursuing policies in which the Indigenous children are far overrepresented in the foster care system in both of those nations. So, but it's a great question. Reparations, I think, is part of this, but it's not the be all and end all that we often think that it would be. Now, I was surprised by that. I thought that it would be something that would give people a lot of feeling of, you know, my government takes this seriously. My government is finally making some sort of redress for this, but it can't happen in isolation from all these other parts of redress.
Well, I find it interesting that like Black and Native restitution, let's say, like they've taken on different terms, like reparations for Black people and like restitution or reconciliation for Native people, even though like the majority of these processes are the same. Like it is an apology, it is kind of an awakening to this kind of history, to the modern day effects of these processes and systems.
Yep.
Okay, so Linda Keenan has a question that I feel actually kind of connects to a bit of what you just said about public monuments and markers. If we are talking about acknowledging more of this history and kind of rewriting this history, is there a place for monuments and historical markers to Native people? Like, do you feel like that is kind of something that we should push for, or does that not really matter in the scheme of things?
Yeah, my thinking really changed on this too. At first, I was really critical of these kind of efforts. I thought that they're very symbolic. You know, memorials are symbolic, or apologies are symbolic. But I think they're important. And again, I think they can't happen in isolation. We could put up new memorials to Native people, and we actually have done so in Lincoln. We have these amazing new enormous statues. We have one of Standing Bear, the Ponca chief. We have now one of a woman named Susan LaFleche, who was the first Native doctor in the United States. She's of the Omaha tribe. And I think these are really important because, you know, they're just these monuments that we create, they are an indication of what we think is important, whose story should be told. So if we only ever have monuments of Confederate generals and Lewis and Clark, we have a lot of Lewis and Clark in Nebraska. If we are only telling one side of the story, and we're often making people into heroes who were actually doing some pretty heinous things. So I think it's important to have these new kinds of monuments that we create. I wish cities were a little bit more intentional about the monuments they decide to erect. It seems so often these monuments are privately funded. There's something that, like, a particular organization which has a really strong agenda of a particular history they want to tell are the ones who fund these things and get them erected. But I would love to see more Native monuments. I think it is important to telling the story. And some of the plaques that you see, in fact, Ari Kelman writes about this a lot around Sand Creek. Some of the old plaques used to call Sand Creek a battle. But we know it was a massacre. It wasn't a battle. And so even the kind of the small roadside plaques that we create, the markers that we create, need a sort of thoroughgoing revision in what and how they portray what happened.
Teresa has a question about education. So in the classroom, so she talks about her home state of South Dakota. The governor and the Education Commission have written their Native history out of their school curriculum. What do you think about places that are actually moving kind of backwards rather than forward?
Yeah, well, I can only think about my childhood, you know, growing up in Colorado, and I just never learned the real history of the state. And I didn't really learn the real history of this place I had grown up in until I was in grad school. And I still don't feel like I know it. I really dived very deeply into Cheyenne and Arapaho history, or at least Sand Creek history, for this book. But I grew up in a place called Ute Pass, and I have not dived very deeply into Ute history. So there's so much more to be learned. But I really feel like my childhood was impoverished, and that I was kind of cheated from learning real history. So I think we're doing a real disservice to our children. And it kind of gets back to sort of where we started the conversation, a feeling like there's a lot of people who want to continue to deny this history. And they'll say things, and we've heard this a lot, like, oh, you're just creating division by bringing up these hard topics. But the division is there. And I don't feel like we can overcome those divisions or create a society that's just for everybody, and I mean by that, just for everybody, I mean justice for everybody. We can't create a society like that. We can't create a fully democratic society as long as we're denying this history, because in denying it, we're denying the ways in which our present day realities are shaped by this history and shaped by the advantages that people like me gained from these settler policies, and the disadvantage that Indigenous people were subject to as a result of these policies and practices.
Well, on a related note, I think this is a good place to end it. Alexa has a second question, and she is really pointing to those people who want to deny that history, and this idea of claiming bad kin. So the responsibility as white people maybe to claim overly white supremacist relatives, and to really, how do you speak to those people, and what do you feel is your responsibility as a researcher and a historian and a family member, a person in society?
I mean, how to respond to people who have close family members who want to deny this, and or even beyond that, are kind of embracing white supremacy. That's a really good question. I wish I could figure that out. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think that we never know how our talking to family members about these things may eventually change their opinion. Some of the research out there shows that we're unlikely to accept a message from somebody who we see as very different from us, or that we don't trust. But most of us trust our family members, even if we might have political disagreements. So it's very difficult to confront somebody, and maybe it's not best done over Facebook, but but to try to have some deep conversations with family members about this, who may not agree, or who may want to deny this history. I think it may have long-term consequences that we may not see for a very long time, but I think it's worth our time, because usually these are people that we have some sort of loving, close relationship with in other areas, if not politically. So hopefully that's a way to have an inroad with people on these topics.
Just try.
I don't know if that helped.
No, it's not an easy question. Well, thank you so much, Margaret.
Thank you, Alaina, and thank you, Politics and Prose, and Morgan.
Oh, and on the behalf of Politics and Prose, I definitely want to thank you both. Personally, I enjoyed this conversation as well, listening in background. We'd also like to thank our audience for tuning in this evening. We definitely want to remind everyone here to pre-order After 100 Winters. It will be out next Tuesday on October 19th. And we also encourage you to purchase a copy of I've Been Here All the While by Alaina E. Roberts as well. Your book purchases are what keep this program going. And we thank you all for continuing to tune in, and have a good evening. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.